Hello, everyone. Oh, that was fast. Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Michael Stewart, and I'm here to welcome you to the first reading in this semester's Nonfiction Now series. Many people, programs, and grants come together to make a reading like this happen, and tonight would not be possible without the generous support of the Shane Family Fund. It also wouldn't be possible without the help of my amazing co-instructor, Elizabeth Rush, or the incredible team we have, Ellen, Aaron, and Emily. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing Maggie Millner. Maggie is the author of Couplets. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, Paris Review, Poetry, Kenyon Review, Bomb, The Nation, and several others. And currently, she is a lecturer at Yale and a senior editor at the Yale Review. I was fortunate enough to have Maggie in one of my classes, and I still remember reading the first piece she submitted. Of course, she was talented and insightful, and her sentences were elegant and precise, but that's not why I remember the piece. It was later in conference when we were talking about her work. She just seemed to enjoy her language. We walked through each line of the piece, and she approached each verb, each modifier with such care and attention. Years later, it was with joy and anticipation that I received my copy of Couplets, and there was, matured and sharpened, that same care. It's a gorgeous book. Some of my favorite moments are when Maggie is lingering on a stray detail, like when she describes the air that comes out of a vape pen as like cleaning solvent or an afterthought of fruit. Maggie braids the quotidian and the erotic. Couplets is a book of mirrors and myths and metamorphosis. A body transforms into a bed into a body. The pronouns slip and evolve. She becomes him, and she becomes she. In preparation for this introduction, I went back to look at that first paper she wrote. And I came across this moment. Don't worry, I promise I'm not gonna read too much of one of your undergraduate pieces. It's just a little blip. But anyway, she wrote, "Even so, color everywhere. Color in the way you understood, surfacing around you in the language of surfaces that might have been your mother's body. Why had no one told you about green? That wonder, that kaleidoscoping moment between lines, and the oneric imagery, they mix together to create a voice which is uniquely Maggie's. But enough of my voice. Please join me in welcoming Maggie Millner.
Thank you, Michael. I have very, very fond and indelible memories of that class. I have so many memories on this campus, and I've been walking around all day feeling a lot of feelings. This reading, just being here, it means more than most of the events I've done. It's like really a certain kind of homecoming, and talking to students today and seeing my book in all of their hands around the table, it was just really brought home to me that I've written a book, which is still surprising to me, but also how formative this place has been for me, and how shaped I've been by the reading and writing practices I learned at Brown. So I'm really, really happy to be back. It's a real honor and a pleasure. I'm going to read a selection of poems from the book. The book is in sections, but it's also one long, continuous narrative. So I'll pause between the sections. They're numbered. I won't read the numbers. I'll just pause, and I'll read kind of chronologically from throughout the book. There are, for those of you who have seen it on the page, there are rhymes, but some of them are sort of a little bit subtler, and you may hear them and you may not. So they're there if you want to listen for them. Couplets. She found me in the winter at a bar, one of those places in Bed-Stuy, not far from Clinton Hill, a platonic meeting set up by a friend who worked in media and thought we'd get along. I got there first and snatched a booth and started reading Middlemarch, a novel I've been halfway through for more than half my life. When she strode through the door, "Oh shit, I love that book. I've read it 15 times," she said, and asked my favorite scene. I looked down at page 98, open on the table. Maybe when Lydgate first meets Dorothea and Eliot's talking about how the, quote, stealthy convergence of human loss, unquote, when analyzed in retrospect, shows a, quote, slow preparation of effects from one life on another, unquote, I replied. Totally, she said. The conversation turned to poetry, our few mutual friends, one's PhD, one's startup, one's divorce. I was too skittish and caught up in my charade to feel charging the space between us like a ray, the knowing gaze of destiny, which Eliot would say stood by sarcastic with our dramatis personae folded in her hand. Besides, I practically had a husband, a man as opposite to her as Casaubon was opposite to Will. On the A train home, I read that paragraph again, then closed the book and marked the chapter, telling myself that I'd resume it after. I thought she thought my life was trivial since she was queer and edited periodicals, and I was a poet who had never dated a woman. Every night, she'd attend some trendy function with people dressed in Eckhouse and Givenchy, while I shambled off to walk-in shows at raunchy bars or raunchier bars that never put on shows. Or anyway, that was my perception. Now I know that hers were mostly networking events, book launches and openings, their settings often even spots where I'd have grabbed a drink myself. Still, when I surveyed the fabric of my life back then, its familiar open work of sex and teaching, Kale and NPR, and the boyfriend at the center I revered but felt I had been failing many years, I dreaded she'd dismiss me. Though when I looked at him and at my friends, I thought, how bad could my life really be with people like these in it? Gentle, loyal, practical, considerate. The difference was I knew my friends, I knew my life, while hers remained a vivid new reality that swirled behind a scintillating door, a world where people wore athleisure haute and seemed to vape incessantly, the sticks lighting up green or white like tiny pagers every time they'd pull. I hated the air that came out of them, the smell like cleaning solvent or an afterthought of fruit, but found them mesmerizing too. I'd zone out and imagine that a tiny person lived inside each cartridge, who would sprint to switch the light bulb on and fan the fire when she felt a drag. She must get so tired, I would think. This elaborate e-cig reverie was not so different from my theory of her life, which, because unknown, was also marvelous and false, complete invention. It took months to really reach her through the cloud of myth my adoration made. Until I could, I lived in fear she'd finally see my fetish and discrepancy and flee. I tried to stay away from her, could not. I'd turn to J or T and say, today's the day it stops. Nothing right should feel this dirty, nothing real this quicksilver and fanged. I kept thinking of that show, My Strange Addiction, which was enjoying a comeback among my peers in those months, despite its cancellation years before, conceptual depravity, and total exploitation of its cast. Reality TV seemed newly relevant, I guess, as life itself grew ever more fictitious, perpendicular to time. Obsession was a subject that obsessed me, regardless of its object, but I hated watching strangers getting hurt by theirs, doll collecting, surgery, ingesting dirt and glass. There was no joy depicted, just decrepitude, abjection, musty rooms. If I directed one, my show would air the pleasures of compulsion and be named, "Screw it, I'm going to text her," or "Nothing's wrong, you're just in love again," or "True Life, turning 28 in Brooklyn." I kept making the same ludicrous wish that the things I didn't like might vanish of their own accord. Envy, pimples, debt, my stack of griefs, the internet, whose central purpose seemed to be to turn the best parts of humanity, our hungers for belonging, art, and sex, into surveillance logs and payouts for execs. It was both invisible and everywhere, like the wealth gap or the ozone layer, and foiled any threat of our collectivizing by rewarding only purchases and infighting. Of course, I had no plan to make it better. And I knew my sneering hauteur was its own repellent habit, an itchy frock I wore to parties where I made small talk about book reviews and carbon capture, while down below the surface of our banter, I'd feel a sheet of rhyme steadily start to form between me and my counterpart. Since when is pleather vegan leather? Since when is theory clearly better intel than the news? I'd retreat to someone's toilet, and despite myself, I'd hit her up, desperate to be lifted from my body. "Come over," she would say. "The literati can't give you what I can." And I'd comply, and it would work. You can't be lonely, after all, if you're not inside yourself. You can't be dwelling if you're somewhere else. I went on apps to meet people who weren't her or him. There'd be this quick hormonal current when my fingers skimming glass achieved the grayed out screen that meant a match, which then a queasy emptiness produced. It was like spying in a closet an old coat you used to wear and finding it still flatters you and even has $1 in the pocket. But then you notice on the collar a large brown stain like blood, and a tear in the lining from that frenzied night in Nanjing with his sister, and a dark moustachial whisker from the cat you owned together on the cuff. And in your hand isn't money, but a ticket stub from when you saw La Grande Bellezza the week after you co-signed your first lease in Monterey. So what had felt before like luck now seems another ploy to show you what you've lost. I'd go for drinks with people over whom I'd passed a thumb in the affirmative, and sometimes it was even sort of nice, drinking turbid natural wines while touching knees, or talking Adrian Piper with an art student I'd soon learn was a biter when we kissed. But beneath the conversation, I'd detect this faint reverberation that, when I listened close, I understood to be her name. And if I tuned in harder, I would often hear, below that pitch, another, deeper throbbing, which was his. When she and I would fight, I'd miss him most. And we were always fighting in those gauzy days of mucus and diaphany when she'd indulge my every schoolgirl fantasy for hours in the house sit and then run out without a word because she had forgot she had a thing. Stuff like that. Not cruel, though often maddening and far below what I'd expected out of him. His love had been the organizing system of my life. I'd known it since 19. When she would breach its terms, my protean heart would thrash against its skin for what it knew would shelter it. for him. Other times, I could feel myself become him. Those tics I'd found most tiresome, his artificial cheer, his trick of going silent in the heat of conflict, or accusing me of being self-indulgent without ever specifying what he meant, suddenly belonged to me, my temper having lifted in our time together some properties of his. His ideas crowded my head as if through an earpiece. His hand's phantom weight guided my own. His scowl in my mirror, and in my microphone, his speech, down to the voice's note of spite, the patronizing diagnosis, the words I'd used to scold her when she told a tasteless joke. It was the same old dialectic I had tried to leave behind. This is partly why I thought I'd lost my mind. But when she'd start to plunge into depression, as I've often done, curled in bed or prostrate on the ground, listing all the people she'd let down, it was by remembering how he'd soothed me that I soothed her. And when I held her cheek against my cheek, I was drawing from the well of love he filled. So I became, after all, not him exactly, but a kind of conduit between them, a conversation they conducted with my mouth. And when I was not unbelievably sad, I was moved unbelievably to hold inside me both my lovers and to introduce them to each other there in the hollow just above the heart among the little folds where the voice starts. I'm reading faster than I thought. I'm going to add in a poem or two. Okay. This is a poem for all the students out there, which is most of you. That fall, I'd rush out of her bed to catch the 7 o'clock train to the college I taught composition at, supporting claims, active voice, citation format. The difference between summary and analysis was a large part of the syllabus, so much so you could say the line between them was the joist on which the whole semester leaned. I think I really liked the teaching, with its emphasis on logic and slow reading, another cornerstone of the curriculum, but also a constraint I'd always suffered from, having no other choice. Before that, I had only ever taught poetry, which had no claim to usefulness, alas, though it allowed me to give out more A's. And in my current role, felt duty-bound to teach my students everything I wished I'd found out about at their age. Evidence must precede argument. Verbs are the heaviest lifters. Change is constant and inexorable. The Oxford comma isn't really optional. You will fall in love. The relationship will end, though not at the same instant as the love. Some version of this will continue, maybe forever, happening to you. Restate your thesis in the final paragraph. You can fuck up and still be fine, remember that. Always include a bibliography. Don't promise your life to anybody. Then I was the only person in my bed, though other people's words ran through my head and kept me company. One was Vivian Gornick, who demanded, put romantic love at the center of a novel today, and who could be persuaded that in its pursuit, the characters are going to get to something large? She argued that in modern life, we buy neither the plot line of the happy wife, nor the one where women self-discover, so to speak, by dint of some new lover. We're too atomized, our institutions too clearly corrupt. Everything we do, we think we have to do ourselves. But she was speaking about prose and the theory that characters should actualize rather than transform as many times as time allows, as is the case in verse where there are barely any characters at all. In poetry, then, let me say that love has been, above all things, the engine of self-knowledge in my life, and even after everything, is still what makes the rest worth suffering. I'll read 2 more. Does that seem right? Okay. I'm going to read 2 more, and then if we have nothing, if there are no questions, maybe I'll scramble and find something else to read. Cold, ecstatic. Walking through the breezeway to the perfume shop where I was a habitué that year, which sold fragrances with biomes as their names, insisting that the body was a place where events occurred rather than a thing to which they happened, to say nothing of the cause of such events, and buying one that advertised itself as woodland, bosky, sylvan, some tree-ish word, and name-dropped Judith Butler on the label, misting my nape with it and feeling sexual and unashamed like a beautiful, deciduous slut of language. Oh, I know how ridiculous what it was I thought in that moment. I am my own husband. But I couldn't stop. I felt that way, bonded to myself by my authority alone. No one beside me, no one on the phone. And going home, writing what I'd seen and heard, adding detail, deepening the hue, switching a word to change or nix a sound, feeling my tongue exult in flights by which experience might vault beyond the mind, become an externality. Like cells, it's still miraculous to me. Love found me twice at once. If it never happens again, I'll still be luckier than the moon. Breathing, typing these lines, texting a friend, checking the time, thinking it wouldn't always be like this, but still, sometimes it was, it is. You could have had everything you wanted, had it been what you wanted. You're cutting through the park at sunset, plain trees, wind, children on the swing set, making the exact sound of humanity. Look how everything moves according to gravity and reaches your perceiving organ according to the qualities of light and oxygen. You bring the apple to your mouth and wish for a little peanut butter to distinguish it. So what? You like what you like. A familiar-seeming man dismounts a bike beneath a branch some birds palaver on and which belongs, you realize now, to the very camperdown Marianne Moore described. 2 elements do not a pattern make. At great cost, you got a sense for what your life could be and still had to admit that, after all, that wasn't really it. Though, okay, it was close. It was on the continuum. This city is absolutely overcome with stories like these, which are the real source of its creepy electricity, the force of its seduction, that and the bagels. You sally forth practicing your kegels, passing a wedding at the boathouse on the Lull water, which is deliciously this quarter of the lake's official name. And you will lose again. And no matter what you do, you can't not want. Dip your foot in if you like. Why not? No one is looking. Thanks. So I think now I will open it up to a Q&A. If y'all have questions, it looks like there's 2 microphones, which should we ask folks to line up behind those microphones yeah, you can find your way to the microphone if you have a question. The question can be, can you read another poem? Whatever. The question can be whatever.
forgot to ask this question
Hi,
before.
Vanya.
Hi. What was your favorite dining hall while you were here? And why wasn't it the Ratty?
It was obviously the Ratty. Yeah, I mean, I spent like a weird amount of time in the Ivy Room. A lot of important things happened to me in the Ivy Room, I'll say that, yeah. I won't tell you what they are, but they were important, yeah. Hi.
Hey, how's it going? So a lot of complications can come from writing about your personal life in intimate detail. I'm sort of curious about how you navigate sort of this loyalty to the truth in the work and I don't want to use the word using, but using the relationships in your life for your art. And do you see a conflict there? And if you do, how do you navigate it?
Well, that's a question I'm going to answer differently than I often do because I'm here at Brown. First of all, I'm here at Brown among my people, and second of all, I'm here with the word nonfiction in the under my name. So I'll respond genuinely instead of demurring. I often say, "What are you talking about? I'm straight and a virgin. This is fiction." But yeah, I mean, there was a question I got earlier in class that has a similar question. It's complicated. My relationship to my writing. Well, I'll say this. I wrote this book for me. I didn't write it for an intended audience or an intended readership, and I wasn't thinking about publication or circulation when I wrote it, and I needed to write something. I needed the experiences and feelings that I'm kind of working through in this book. I really could have only worked through in language in this particular way. That's how it works for me. That's what I've spent my time training my brain to do. And I don't think I don't feel terribly ethically complicated about writing for myself, right? It becomes complicated when we think about readership and other people's lives, perhaps being exposed to strangers or even to other intimates, right? Other folks who know the people involved. I mean, I was careful. There's nothing. If you know me, I think you know who these people are, who the characters are sort of based on real people. If you don't, there's really no identifying information. So that I think helps. There's no names or even initials or really ways of identifying who they are. And I'm not on the internet, so. You really probably can't, well, maybe, I don't know, don't try, but I don't think you can find out who these people are, even if you really wanted to. So I'll say that, I mean, their anonymity was important for me to preserve. I think also, ultimately this is, when I've asked myself this question, like, I feel a great deal of tenderness for these people, and I have trusted that comes through in the work, and also I allowed myself to write about them knowing that was the kind of predominating feeling that I had, and that seemed to me to be, that like love and compassion are very much part of like the practice of imagining, of writing and of imagining oneself, into other subjectivities, perhaps. So, yeah, I think it's a complicated question. I think it's different for every project I do. But in this case, I'll say this also because I'm here among my buds. I didn't think that the book would really have a terribly wide readership when you sit down to write something in rhyming couplets in the year of our Lord, like 2020, which is when I was writing this. It wasn't, I wasn't like, oh, people are gonna really, people are gonna read this. I was like LOL, okay, this is fun for me. So the sort of gravity of that decision, of the decision to write about myself, is one that I sort of understood only later after this was written and I was really like approaching publication. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. First of all, I'd like to say that I've also witnessed lots of things in the Ivy Room. I saw a lesbian couple
talk.
break up, so that was
Huge.
a highlight.
Huge.
But
Did they still have the falafel?
They do. What? Did they not anymore?
Did they have falafel?
I think they had them.
Well, no,
Yeah,
I know
it's not good.
Trust me, I know it's bad.
Oh, okay.
The question is, does it still exist?
Yeah.
It still exists. Okay, it was. I can't
They
even
had these
describe what
quesadillas.
texture it was, but it was something. Yeah.
But yeah, I just was curious. Well, first of all, queerness is a funky thing. And in one of your poems, at 1.12, you kind of are like, I guess it's implied that you're kind of talking about what you make of your relationship with your ex-boyfriend. And in a quote you say, this one I really do believe, is that for years I loved him more than me. And I feel like I was kind of wondering, like, I know a lot of people say, like, oh, you shouldn't love someone else until you learn to love yourself, and that whole thing. Like, do you feel like this like journey you went on throughout the book was inspired by this like self-love, or was that more of just a way of you like thinking about it, making yourself feel better, and it was more of like a spur of the moment kind of thing you've also like talked about like in the book, like motivating your reasonings for things?
Okay, I love that question, and I've never gotten it before. And I think it's a sort of crucial question in the composition of this book and for the version of myself that was asking these questions. So that section that you're quoting from, it starts by saying, I start by saying, like, how do I say it? There are many ways, of course, of telling this, but each account obscures some other version equally true. So I think so that's, that is something I actually believe, which is that there's, multiple, we can have multiple competing narratives of, our own lives, and we tell ourselves maybe different stories at different moments of our lives. I think ultimately what I came to understand as I was writing this book is that what I was charting was a kind of journey out of various kinds of codependency, of trying to define myself relationally. And in the book, I think I don't renounce the power of romantic love. In fact, I think I kind of stridently reaffirm it over and over. But I think that what we also see, from the vantage of, as the reader, I think we see someone gaining a kind of autonomy and finding a language, perhaps actually through the writing. Like, the writing isn't a document of something that's some process that's already happened. It's sort of enabling the kinds of the kinds of complex self-knowledge that the speaker arrives at. So I do think there's a kind of self-love that emerges, in those last couple of poems I wrote, which are the final poems in the book. Like, that's a different person, really, than the person who began the book, who began writing the book, and who the book depicts at the beginning, right? And I could say a lot of things about, also just the way that femme people in straight relationships are, encouraged to kind of prioritize certain kinds of caretaking, or certain kinds of, we're socialized perhaps to kind of conform to other people's ideas of us or other narratives. So I think that's a little bit baked into that line you're quoting. For years I loved him more than me. Perhaps there's also like, this is something we're socialized to prioritize, and part of what this speaker, this version of myself, is figuring out is kind of how to not just love herself, but love herself as a queer femme person in the world that she lives in, which is a complicated thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Hi again.
Hi
Long time no see. You sort of touched on this a little bit earlier in class, but I was wondering how you navigate really the relationship between the form and the content, and you do such a good job in the book, but especially how do you navigate that in like the editing and the revision process?
So the question is your question about the form of the couplet or the kind of shape of the book as a whole with those alternating couplet and...
I think in general, just like how the book is structured.
Yeah.
And like how do you navigate that relationship and that structure with the kind of content that you wanted to put in the book and that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. I mean, I am of the opinion that, something important I read when I was at Brown was a little text called The Heresy of Paraphrase. But for real, like, I think that the way something is written, the form is inseparable. I couldn't, and I think poetry is a mode that really perhaps underscores this fact. But form and content, to me, they don't feel like separable. They don't feel like extricable things. It feels like the only way into the content, is through, or the only way, and the medium is the message. That's another good one. That's another good one I'll quote from. Like, these ideas that form is coextensive with content, I think while I was an undergrad and then still as a writer, like these are very formative ideas for me. And so it was much less about kind of like having some themes that I needed to put in a container or a narrative that I needed to kind of fit into a container, and more about the story as an emergent feature of writing, and the story. And I didn't really know. I mentioned this in class too. Like, I didn't really know how it ended. There was a long time where I thought maybe it was a sort of triumphal queer narrative where the narrator, the I, like, ends up in a pretty like happy and mutually sustaining queer relationship with the woman who's depicted in the book. Like, I thought that for a very long time while I was writing the book. And so, so I wasn't writing with some kind of sense of the narrative arc or wanting to get at certain themes or thinking it would be clever to do certain, to talk about certain things in a certain way. It really was like the process of writing in this form that it's sort of self-generated. In terms of your question about revision and the editorial process, the prose came later on. I realized, as I mentioned, like, I wanted a kind of counterpoint. I wanted a second mode in a book that's so much about duality. It seemed appropriate to kind of have a second mode, a kind of interlocutor. The pronouns shift in that section. Also, the gaze has a different sort of directionality, right? And it's also a way of kind of getting outside the relentlessness, the really claustrophobic box of the I, of the first person narrator, right? And of the couplet form, of course, the repetitive couplet form. But so I introduced the prose later, and that was a big kind of revision. And I even revised some poems into prose versions of themselves. And then editorially, it was really, the major kind of, I didn't, pre-publication, I didn't really have the question of like the couplets and the prose, that was sort of already worked out. The more major kind of revisionary questions were about the coherency of the narrative, which, because I had written it in this disjointed way and in these kind of achronological sections, didn't make a whole lot of sense, even when I kind of put them in chronological order. And so then I had to write into the gaps, but I also had to rewrite a lot of the poems to sort of clarify just the kind of situation. I think also, as someone who, I thought I was writing, poetry, or I thought I was writing like a collection of poems maybe. It didn't really occur to me this was one single coherent narrative. And so there wasn't that mandate for like situational clarity as I wrote the individual poems, because poems, brief lyric poems, they don't need to set a scene in quite the same way, and they don't need to clarify who's speaking or why or what the context is, right? That's part of why we turned to them. But then when it became a different kind of book, I realized there was a lot of revision I had to do in terms of just simply clarity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, first of all, beautiful reading.
Thank
and
you.
As Michael said, gorgeous writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So careful in its words and so great in the reading. So
Thank you.
I had two questions. One was, you make an interesting distinction between sort of is writing about, and maybe not writing, but you make a duality between self-actualization and relationships, and like, what is the premise of a book or a story? So I'd love you to hear just talk more about that, although it might relate to the previous good question that was asked. And then just wondered, since so many students want to publish a book like this, could you talk us through your process of how you published it?
Yeah. Like the question of relationships and self-actualization, I feel strongly that we're like we're very social, relational kinds of creatures, and self-knowledge, like it can't actually really happen. Self-insight, it is something that happens sort of dialogically. That's the basis of Freudian therapy. Is it's talking, it's language, and it's not just language in a void. It's language, with a kind of imagined addressee. That's, I think, key to, and language itself, putting things in language is inherently, language is a social, it comes out of a social function, right? That's what it is, and how it originated, right? So I think that question of like self-actualization versus relationship I think self-actualization happens in social, modes. I also think at the same time, especially romantic relationships or, very, very close, parental or familial or, even platonic relationships that we become so habituated to as to stop being able to kind of see ourselves or see our role in them. I think those kinds of relationships can prevent self-knowledge, right? And so I think there, the book is sort of dancing between this, as I said, this kind of strongly held belief in relationality and intimacy and exchange, interpersonal exchange, as the kind of stage on which self-knowledge happens. But at the same time, it's interested in a kind of understanding an independent self and extricating oneself from perhaps being totally subsumed or having a totally relational self-definition. So I think does that answer that first question?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
And then publishing a book, man, I wish that I had a nice, neat story to tell everyone. My story is totally idiosyncratic and unorthodox, and I did a lot of things wrong. But we're at an interesting moment. My training is as a poet, and poetry books are not marketable. Poets don't generally have agents. They don't generally make very much money, if any. And so and usually the way a poet goes about publishing a first book is by winning a contest, which is an incredibly demoralizing, you have no agency if that's how you hope to become a published writer, is you throw your name in the ring and you don't even know it's a totally opaque kind of process, and nobody's advocating for you. In prose, that's very different. In prose, you would hopefully, at the point that you're kind of submitting a finished manuscript, you would have representation by an agent. I mean, that's a whole other messed up thing, but it helps, it helps if you have an agent as a prose writer. Poets don't usually have those. I sent, it's like a long kind of boring story, but I tried to get an agent and couldn't, because I was writing poetry. They said, well, this is poetry, and I was like, I think it could be something, I think you could probably sell it if you tried, and and everyone said no to me, but so then I got really scrappy, and I wrote to. I mean, this was after this was after a long time of kind of just getting rejection after rejection. I went through my contact list, and I was like, who do I know who's worked in publishing? I have an editorial job, so I know some, I have at a magazine, not at a publishing house, but I've lived in New York for a few years. Like I know some people. Like I went to Brown, and and some of my former roommates, at some point worked in publishing. Like, let me look through my contacts, because I really believed in the book. And I got some emails of some editors, and I wrote to them directly with an introductory email from whatever mutual contact we had, and I got 2 offers from big houses. And at that point, I texted my friend, and I was like, I need to talk to an agent. I'm about to totally mess this up. I don't know what I'm doing. And my friend had his agent call me, and then she signed me. And then we chose FSG, that's the publisher, which had been my dream publisher. I mean, from sort of like childhood, had been like my dream publisher. I'd published a lot of the books that were really formative for me. So that was cool that worked, but it was, if I had believed in the book even a fraction less, I don't know. I just really, kept pushing and kept asking for favors, and it worked. Yeah, I didn't make a lot of money, but it worked. It exists in the world, and they did, and it's it looks so pretty, and so that's how it happened for me. Yeah.
Can I cheat with a third question?
Please.
I'm really sorry, but now I'm compelled.
There's nobody in line.
I feel like I'm just, representing another person's question, which is, what are you working on now, given that this is done really well? It's beautiful. It's really well done. So I'm curious, what next?
Yeah, great question. Everybody's chomping at the bit. No, I'm just kidding. No, I realized, this goes back to kind of a conversation we were having in class today. I realized when this book started to, it's done better than expected. It's gotten, it got really nice reviews in places that I had no fantasy of having a review in, and people have been teaching it. Yay, thank you for teaching it. And yeah, it has a little bit of a life of its own. And so when I sort of realized that started happening, I was like, okay, now is my moment. I'm gonna write a novel. And it's gonna make me $1 million, and it's gonna be so awesome. Because that's the only way, really, that I can imagine being having the luxury of being a full-time writer is you get a really, I know people who have gotten these really fat book advances and who are just kind of chilling. And I was like, that sounds so nice. I would love to do that. So I tried this book between, acceptance and publication took almost 2 years. So in that window, I was writing short stories to kind of warm myself up for my big novel. And then I was writing, and then I tried to write the novel all different ways. I wrote 2 pages of it ever. And I just have I don't want to, and I can't do it. And I'm writing now something I'm excited about, which is a long, extremely obscure poem that I hope will be a book-length poem about being stoned in a movie theater. And I hope, and it's, I love it. I'm like in love with it. Like I'm having so much fun. I don't know how wide the readership will be, but it's feeling the way, I was saying this in class, it's feeling a little bit the way this felt, which was like, I'm onto something here, and I feel like, the juices are flowing, and, I don't know, maybe it'll turn into something that transcends the situation of simply being stoned in a movie theater. I hope it will, because that is not marketable. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. Hi. Oh, you have
Hello.
questions, great.
You might have touched on this a little bit in an earlier question, but I would just be curious to get a little bit more on your thoughts about the line as a basic unit of meaning in poetry and like what its responsibilities are, aside from obviously just like meeting a form in couplets or whatever, but where does the value of the break come in? And also I noticed when you're reading aloud, like kind of how does that, how do the rhymes still factor in there?
That's crazy. I gave an hour-long lecture on the line as the basic unit of meaning in poetry yesterday. So I have way too many things to say about it, and I know we're about to run out of time. Oh, it's such a good question. I have so much to say. Where should I begin? Denise Levertov has a great essay on this subject, where she talks about the line break. So the way we organize, language and prose and sentences is, according to meaning. We want to facilitate clear reading. We want to facilitate understanding for the reader. That's why punctuation, things like punctuation and grammar and capitalization and these conventions. That's what they're there to do. The line break has no such sort of semantic mandate. It can operate all kinds of ways. And what it does, what Levertov argues is that it introduces some alogical kind of axis into the kind of like form of the poem. It also it feels important to me that if we think of the line as the basic unit of poetry, it's because poetry comes from an oral. That's what poetry is. It is this unbroken kind of tradition that comes out of orality, comes out of collective authorship. It comes out of being in a room together and saying something that's memorable, that has these prosodic features, because we want people to remember it, and we need to remember it in order to recite it. And it has this sort of musical function too. And line breaks. That's why when people went to write it down, when written language was invented, that's why lines break where they do, because they break at the end of the metrical phrase. They break at the end of they break at the rhyme, or and then we restart the kind of musical phrase. So I think about it a lot. It's something I think deeply about. I don't have one relationship to it. That's the other thing, is sometimes the line break is, especially in this book, sometimes the line breaks are kind of fake. I've written a kind of prosaic sentence, and I go back in and I'm like, oh, those words sort of rhyme with each other. I'm gonna break the line there. I got one. There was one terrible review of this book by someone who hated it, who was like, that's not what rhyme is. This book doesn't rhyme. He's a prominent scholar. I was like, I know it doesn't always rhyme, okay? I wrote it. But yeah, so, so I use the line break, I think, in a lot of different ways in this book, and part of what the rhymes, do is they kind of vacillate between kind of real rhymes and kind of cryptic rhymes, or kind of more or subtler rhymes, and having both of those different kinds of those kind, if a rhyme is the kind of terminal sound of the line, right? Having multiple ways that operates feels important to me in a text that has multiple kind of maybe competing narratives and in which multiple competing selves and logical systems are operating. Okay, I think we're out of time, but thank you all so much for listening and your questions.